The smell of the ink was stronger than the blood. I pulled the last damp leaflet from the stencil, the words still smearing under my thumb. Katalin's coat was on the floor, the tear at the shoulder where they'd grabbed her. She stood at the sink, washing a cut above her eye, not speaking. The stack of papers waited by the door. We had to burn them. We had to burn everything. I held the first page to the stove's blue flame. My name was in her coat pocket. My name is Erzsébet Vásárhelyi. I was born in Budapest in 1938, and I am speaking to you now in 1996, in the same city, in a flat not far from where I grew up. I was 18 years old in the autumn of 1956. When I try to reach back further, to the years before, the first thing I find is always a smell. The smell of boiled cabbage. That's what I remember first, from childhood, from the years when I was perhaps 7 or 8. It lived in the stairwell of our building on Rákóczi. A damp, heavy smell that clung to the plaster walls and the worn wooden banister. It was the smell of every evening, of every family, in every flat, cooking the same thin soup. My mother would leave before dawn, her good coat over her nightdress, a headscarf tied under her chin. I'd hear the door click. She'd join the queue outside the cousère, standing in the dark for cooking fat, for grey bread that tasted of sawdust. We had 2 rooms. My father was a railway clerk, his uniform hung by the door, smelling of coal smoke and damp wool. His world was timetables and schedules, things that ran on predictable tracks. Ours did not. At school, when I was 12, we had a different portrait on the wall above the blackboard. Not a saint, Matyas Rákóczi, with his round glasses and his little smile. We recited the pioneer's oath every Monday. I promise to work, study, and fight for the building of socialism. I had the words memorized, my voice clear and loud with the others. But even then, at 12, I knew the difference between the words in my mouth and the thoughts in my head. It was a performance, like a play where everyone knows their lines, but no one believes the story. The chalk dust would float in the shaft of light from the single bulb, and I'd watch it settle on Rákóczi's framed face, a fine grey powder. I wondered if the janitor ever wiped it off. The letter came in the summer of 1956. I was 17, nearly 18. I had won a place, Eötvös Loránd University. Faculty of Hungarian Literature. I was the first in my family. My father held the paper, his railwayman's hands careful not to crease it. His pride was a quiet, swelling thing in our kitchen. But that night, as he handed it back to me, he leaned close, the smell of his cheap tobacco. "Keep your head down, Erzzy," he whispered. "Heads that rise get taken off." He never said things like that. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the cabbage smell. It was the first time I understood my opportunity as a kind of danger. And then, the dormitory. I was 18 by then, a first-year student that October. A room for 4 girls, iron beds, thin blankets. We shared a single electric ring to heat water for tea. But on the shelves, between the approved textbooks, were other books. Dog-eared copies of Petőfi, passed from hand to hand, spines cracked from being read under blankets. That October, the air in the lecture halls changed. It became electric. A professor would pause, look out at us over his spectacles, and then say something that was not in the curriculum. A reference to a banned writer, a question about form over ideology. He wouldn't elaborate. He'd just let the sentence sit there, a gift wrapped in silence. We'd all lean forward just a little. We were learning a new language, and the first rule was to listen for what wasn't being said. It was a life of contradictions. Grey bread and poetry. My father's fear and my professor's courage. The public words we were supposed to chant and the private words we began to taste in our mouths, forbidden and sweet. I felt stretched between them. In that cramped dorm room with the smell of damp wool and cheap soap, we talked about metaphors. We argued about iambic pentameter. It felt like a rebellion in itself, to care so deeply about something the state deemed harmless. But we were starting to understand that the words on the page were never just words. They were maps. They could tell you where you were, and more importantly, where you weren't allowed to go. I didn't know it then. I was 18 and certain of very little, but we were all learning to read a different kind of text. The text of the silence between the lines. The text of a glance. We were preparing, without knowing it, for a moment when the whispers would have to become a shout. It was September, and the air in the city had changed. It was still warm, but the change wasn't in the weather. It was in the way people looked at each other in the university corridors. A held glance, a fraction of a second too long. A question left hanging. My father's warning was a constant hum in my ear, but there was a new sound too, a murmur. It led me to a lecture hall near the university one Tuesday night. I went alone. I told myself I was just curious. The hall was so packed people were sitting on the floor in the aisles, on the windowsills. The heat was immense, a wall of bodies and wool and cigarette smoke that caught in your throat. This was the Petőfi Circle. I'd heard the name whispered, a debating society. But this was no debate, it was an exhalation. A young man, a journalist I think, was at the podium. He was talking about press censorship, but not in the abstract ideological way we were used to. He was naming names. He was citing specific articles that had been killed. And the room. The room was listening. Not nodding obediently, but leaning forward. I could feel the collective intake of breath. Then he took out another paper. He said, "I will now read from an essay by György Lukács on socialist realism." A complete silence fell. Lukács was banned. His ideas were poison. The young man cleared his throat and began to read. It was about art, about truth. I don't remember the exact words now. I remember the air leaving my lungs. I remember looking around, waiting for someone in a leather coat to stand up, for it all to stop. But no one did. He finished the passage, and then the room erupted, not in argument, but in applause. A crashing, defiant wave of it, that sound. It wasn't just approval, it was a dam breaking. I understood in that moment that the fear had not disappeared, but it had been outnumbered. We had crossed a line simply by sitting there and listening, and we could not uncross it. After that, the world split in two. There was the official world of lectures and required readings. And then there was the other world, which happened in whispers after dark. That was Katalin's world, Katalin, my closest friend. A philosophy student from Miskolc with a laugh that could silence a room and a mind like a steel trap. She shared a dormitory room with me. One night, after lights out, she slid from her bed and sat on the edge of mine. "Listen," she whispered. She had a book, not just any book. It was a Soviet-approved text on Marxist economics, thick and dull. But she opened it, and inside, the pages had been hollowed out. Nestled inside was another book, a contraband copy of Milovan Djilas's The New Class. She read passages to me in a voice so low I had to hold my breath to hear. It was a critique of the communist bureaucracy from within. It called them a new ruling class. Hearing those words in Hungarian, in Catalin's steady whisper, in our own room, it made the ideas we'd heard at the Petőfi Circle concrete. They weren't just theories. They were descriptions of our lives. Of the block warden, of the party secretary at the university, of the men who decided what we could read. We were dismantling the world brick by brick under a blanket with a torch. And then there was the radio. Katalin had a small transistor, a miracle of tin and wire. Late at night, we would huddle under her blanket, the rough wool scratchy on our cheeks. She would turn the dial slowly, through the static and the martial music, until we found it. A voice, clear and calm, speaking Hungarian, but not from Budapest, from Vienna. Radio Free Europe. They reported on the Petőfi Circle meetings. They used words our newspapers did not. Intellectual ferment, student demands. Hearing a Hungarian voice describe what was happening inside my own country from the outside. It was a kind of vertigo. It made the official news bulletins sound like what they were, a child's fairy tale, thin and ridiculous. We were living one reality, and they were broadcasting another. And for the first time, I believed the one coming from far away more. That autumn, I stopped feeling like a student and started feeling like a conspirator. Every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged over a censored newspaper, every burst of forbidden static from that little radio was a thread weaving a new reality. It was fragile, this new thing. It existed in smoke-filled halls and under blankets. But it felt more solid, more true, than the world of portraits and slogans I had grown up in. I didn't know what would happen. None of us did. But the silence had been broken, and we were all listening now, straining to hear what would come after the quiet. We were waiting for the next word. It was a Tuesday. I remember that. A Tuesday in October, and I had a lecture on 19th century lyric poetry at 10. I was walking across the university courtyard with Katalin, our breath-making little clouds in the cold air, arguing about 80s metaphors, when we felt the current change. It wasn't a sound at first, more a vibration, a rumor moving through the corridors like a wire humming. Students were gathering. They were going to march to the emblems statue to show solidarity with Poland. Gomułka had stood up to Moscow. We looked at each other. We didn't say a word. We just turned, our books still under our arms, and let the current take us. It felt less like a decision and more like a door swinging open in a draft you didn't create. We started as a few hundred, a stream of students in worn coats and knitted scarves. By the time we reached the embankment, the stream had become a river, then a flood. Tens of thousands. Strangers linked arms. I was pressed against people I had never seen, their shoulders against mine, their breath on my neck. And then someone began to sing. It started low, from the middle of the crowd, a few notes of the Shuzat, then the band national anthem, the hymnush, and it swelled. It wasn't singing you heard with your ears, you felt it in your chest, in the cobblestones under your feet. That was the warmth, a physical heat that rose from all of us, a collective courage. I have never felt anything like it, before or since. It was the one time in my life I was not afraid. We filled Bem Square, a living, breathing mass. The statue of the Polish general looked down on us. And then a young man, I never saw his face, shimmied up a lamppost. He had a Hungarian flag. He was shouting, his voice cracking. He grabbed at the center of the flag, at that red star, that hated circle of wire and cloth, and he tore. It ripped with a sound like fabric, but louder. He held the torn star aloft for a second, then flung it into the crowd. And the flag, it had a hole, a perfect, ragged hole right in the middle, the roar that went up then. It wasn't human. It was the sound of the city itself exhaling a breath it had held for a decade. I screamed. My throat tore raw. I screamed until I had no voice left. And I was crying. Hot, stupid tears I didn't understand. They just ran down my face, and I didn't wipe them away. It was the hole, that empty space in the fabric. It meant everything we had never been allowed to say. The river kept moving. It carried us through the darkening city toward the Radio Budapest building. We wanted them to broadcast our demands. The air was electric, but colder now. The warmth of the crowd couldn't reach the edges anymore. We were on Brody Sandor Street, pressed in a tight bottleneck, when we heard the first shots, not fireworks, a flat, ugly crack. Then another. The crowd surged backward, a single animal flinching. People began to run. I stumbled, caught by Katalin. And that's when I saw him. He was lying face down on the wet cobblestones. A young man. He wore a university scarf, the colors of ELTE, just like mine. One of his hands was stretched out, and in it he still held a rolled-up leaflet. He wasn't moving. The world narrowed to that patch of street, to that scarf, to the perfect stillness of his fingers. I had never seen a dead person before. I didn't know death could look so ordinary, so quiet in the middle of all that noise. The river of people parted around him, and I just stood there, staring. Katalin pulled at my arm, her voice a sharp whisper in my ear, but I couldn't hear the words. All I could think was that he had been part of the warmth, and now he was cold. The street wasn't a river anymore. It was a place where people could be left behind. We ran too, of course. Back to the dormitory, hearts hammering, the taste of iron in our mouths. But we didn't go to sleep. None of us did. We huddled in rooms, voices low, listening to the radio crackle with impossible news. The regime was shaking. And in that strange, suspended night, a question formed hard and urgent in my chest. He had a leaflet in his hand. Someone had printed it. If words could get you killed, then maybe, just maybe, they could also be a weapon. We had to make more. For 3 days, The world we knew simply unraveled. I stood with a crowd on Kustassa Sad Ter and watched people throw furniture from the windows of the AVH headquarters. Papers floated down like black snow. I saw men I didn't know, men with hollow eyes and prison haircuts, embraced by strangers on the steps of the parliament. And Imre Nagy was on the radio, our prime minister. It was vertigo. The fear I had been taught to breathe since childhood, the fear that held the walls up, it just evaporated. And in that new weightless air, you felt you had to grab something, do something, to prove you were really here. That's when Miklos found me. He was a year ahead in literature, a serious boy with ink stains on his cuffs even before all this. He took my elbow in the university corridor, his voice low. We have a machine, in a cellar near Ferenciek Ter. We need hands. No other explanation. I just nodded. That evening, I descended into a basement that smelled of damp coal and machine oil. The mimeograph was an old rattling beast. You cranked the handle, and with each turn, the drum went ka-chunk, hiss, and a fresh page curled out, the ink still gleaming. Miklos showed me how to mix the thick, violet-black paste, how to align the stencil. We worked in shifts. The rhythm was everything, ka-chunk, hiss, ka-chunk, hiss, a mechanical heartbeat. By midnight, my fingers, my palms, the cuffs of my blouse were stained, a permanent deep black. It wouldn't wash out for weeks. I remember looking at my ruined hands under the bulb and feeling a fierce, absurd pride. This was the proof. This blackness was mine. I didn't just feed the machine. One night, Miklos pushed a blank stencil and a stylus toward me. Write what they need to hear. So I did. 16 lines. I quoted Petőfi, "We swear that we will no longer be slaves," and next to it, in my own blunt words, the demand, the immediate and total withdrawal of Soviet forces from Hungarian soil. When the first copy came off the drum, I held it. The paper was warm. The words I had carved into the wax were now solid, multiplied, able to leave this room. For the first time in my life, the size of the thing I had done felt equal to the size of the thing I felt. There was no gap. But that wasn't all Miklos asked for. Later, when the machine was quiet for a moment, he spoke without looking at me. "We need to know who in your dormitory is reliable, and who is not." He meant the informants. The ones who reported to the party secretary. Everyone knew the system, even if we didn't know all the names. My mouth went dry. He needed a list. I sat with my notebook later in my room. I wrote 2 names I was certain of. A girl from Szeged, who was always too friendly with the dormitory supervisor. A boy who had suddenly stopped arguing in politics class last spring. I put my pen down. Then I picked it up again. I wrote a 3rd name, a quiet girl from my literature seminar. I wasn't certain. I had only seen her coming out of the administrative office once, looking flushed. A suspicion, nothing more. I gave the list to Miklos the next day. I have thought about that 3rd name, that question mark I made into a fact, for 40 years. What did they do with those lists in those feverish days when we were suddenly in charge? I never asked. I was afraid of the answer. We printed until the news changed. Until the announcements on the radio began to speak of a new Hungary, a neutral Hungary. We stopped because we thought we had won. We walked out of that cellar, squinting in the daylight, our hands black, our heads light with a kind of victory. We believed the words we had been printing had become true, simply by the force of their repetition. For a handful of days, the entire city seemed to run on that same fragile, beautiful faith. I remember the sound of my father weeping. It was a sound I had never heard before. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his head bowed over the small, brown Bakelite radio. The voice of Imre Nagy was coming through the static, announcing that Hungary was withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact. My father's shoulders were shaking. My mother stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her face pale. He looked up at me, his glasses smudged, and said, "I never thought I would hear this. Not in my lifetime," he meant, not in his. For a moment, the air in that cramped kitchen felt different. It felt like a door had been blown open after decades of being sealed shut. Those were the 11 days. Late October into early November 1956. The city breathed differently. I walked down Vashy Street and saw the state bookshop. In the window, where there had always been the same approved volumes, were handwritten signs. Titles I had only ever seen mentioned in whispers. Darkness at Noon. Animal Farm. A man in a shabby coat stood staring at them, his fingers pressed to the glass as if he could touch the words inside. In a cafe near the university, the usual murmur was gone. People spoke at full volume, arguing about coalition governments, land reform, the future. No one glanced over their shoulder. And I saw our neighbor, Mr. Kovacs, who had been the party block warden for our building. He was on the front steps, fumbling with the red star pin on his lapel. He didn't see me. He just got the pin off, looked at it in his palm for a second, and put it in his pocket. The university hall was packed that night. Students standing on chairs, sitting on the floor, smoke hanging in layers under the lights. They were drafting a manifesto for a free Hungarian student union. I had written my own version, a single page I carried folded in my pocket. I don't know what came over me. My friend Katalin nudged me. "Go on," she whispered. My legs carried me to the lectern. The paper shook in my hands. My voice, when it came out, was thin and unfamiliar. I read my points: a free press, the removal of all compulsory Marxist-Leninist courses, student representation on faculty boards. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. Then the applause started. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. A man I didn't know clapped me on the shoulder as I stepped down. Well said. For those few minutes I wasn't just Erzsébet, the careful daughter of a railway clerk. I was a person with a voice that mattered. But I also remember what I chose not to see, or what I saw and forced into a compartment in my mind labeled necessary. I saw 2 AVH officers pulled from a car near the Corvin Cinema. The crowd. It wasn't a political act anymore. It was a fury. I turned away before it was over. I saw a man hanging from a lamppost on the Kurut. Someone had put a sign around his neck. I walked faster, my eyes on the cobblestones. I told myself this was the price, that the fear they had sown for years was now being harvested. I told myself revolutions were not tidy. It was a justification I constructed in the moment, and I have spent decades since taking it apart, brick by brick, and finding nothing solid at its core. because in those faces, in the crowd's roar, I didn't see freedom being born. I saw something else being unleashed. That's the memory that haunts me now. Not the beautiful, fragile hope of the bookshop signs or the applause in the hall, but the ugliness I walked past. Because I knew, even then, that a world built on that could not stand. It was too much like the world it wanted to replace. We had 11 days to imagine something entirely new, and we could not escape the old grammar of violence. I went to sleep on the night of November 3rd still believing we might. I believed the radio broadcasts, the rumors that the UN was intervening. I believed the Soviets would accept our neutrality. I believed, right up until the moment the sound of the world changed. The sound came through the floorboards first, a low, grinding vibration in the dark. I was still half in a dream, and I thought it was the central heating, some old pipe, shuddering to life. Then Katalin was shaking me, her hand cold on my shoulder. Her voice was a tight wire. They're back. The Soviets are back. I can hear them on the radio. She had the little radio, the one we used for the Voice of America, tucked under the blanket with her. She held it to my ear. Static, then a voice in Hungarian, frantic, cutting in and out. Radio Free Europe. Then she switched to Radio Budapest, a man's voice, mid-sentence, speaking about sovereignty, and then a sharp crackle. And silence. Not dead air, but a hollow, empty silence that was worse. Katalin's eyes were huge. She whispered the words she'd just heard, the last broadcast. Our troops are fighting. I notify the people of our country and the entire world of this fact. I didn't know then that they were Imre Nagy's last public words. But I felt their weight. I would repeat them to myself for years, like a prayer for something already lost. The dormitory woke around us, not with shouts, but with a terrible, efficient quiet. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps, running, then stopping. Someone screamed once down the corridor, and it was cut short. We moved like we were underwater. Katalin started stuffing clothes into a rucksack. I just sat there. Then I remembered. The bottom drawer of my desk. I had kept them. Not to use, just to have. Proof. The mimeographed leaflets from the basement. The ones I had written. The ones with my hands stained black. I pulled them out. The paper felt sinful. I took them to the bathroom. Others had the same idea. The sink was full of burning paper, the air acrid. I didn't look at the others. I tore each leaflet methodically along the lines of type until the words were just scraps. I fed them to the flame. I watched my 16 lines quoting Petőfi curl and blacken. I stirred the ash with my finger until it was a gray paste, and then I turned the tap and washed myself away. The water ran gray, then clear. By then, the gray light of dawn was at the window. It wasn't a real dawn, just a lightening of the dark to a dirty wool color. I went back to our room. Katalin was by the window, her back to me. I stood beside her. We looked down at the boulevard. It was empty. And then it wasn't. A tank, a T-54. It moved so slowly, with a kind of terrible patience. The grinding sound was its tracks on the cobblestones. The turret turned, just a few degrees, the gun barrel searching, and there, in the gutter, was the flag, the one with the hole, lying in the wet. It wasn't flying, it was discarded. Trash. I understood then. The 11 days were not a beginning. They were an interruption. And now the interruption was over. Everything that came next would not be about conviction. It would be about calculation. It would be about survival. The sound of the tank faded down the street. The silence it left behind was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Katalin didn't look at me. She kept staring at the street, at the flag. Her bag was packed at her feet. I knew what she was thinking. I was thinking it too. But the thought was so large, so terrifying, it had no shape yet. It was just a cold stone in my stomach. We stood there until the room was fully light, a flat November light that promised nothing. We had not spoken since the radio. What was there to say? The words had all been said, and then the words had been burned. All we had left was the waiting, and the knowing what the other was too afraid to ask. The afternoon light was already fading. It was the kind of grey, damp November light that seems to seep into the walls. I was sitting on my bed trying to read a book of poems, but the words were just shapes. I couldn't hear the words, only the silence. The dormitory was too quiet. Everyone was hiding in their rooms, waiting. And then there was a soft, frantic knock. It was Katalin. She came in and closed the door behind her, leaning against it. She was breathing hard. There was a cut, a deep scratch really, above her left eye. It had bled down her temple, dried in a rusty line. She still had her coat on. She said she'd been near Corvin Coos, where the barricade had been. They were sweeping the area. An OVH man in a civilian coat had stopped her, asked for her papers. He'd found the leaflets in her inner pocket. Not many. 3 or 4. He'd taken her name. He'd asked for other names. She looked at me and her eyes were so clear, so terribly honest. She said, "I didn't give them yours, Erzi. I didn't." She said it like it was a gift she was handing me. And then she told me what she wanted. She'd heard from someone who knew someone that people were still getting across at Ando, the Austrian border. That there was a way she wanted us to go, together, right then. She had a little money. She knew a truck driver who might take us part of the way. She was frightened, yes, but there was a wild, hopeful energy in her, an escape route, a plan, and I just sat there. I looked at her, at the blood on her face, at the hope in her eyes, and I felt this. This coldness spread through my chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was calculation, a swift, silent arithmetic. My father's job on the railways, my mother's health, my own place at the university, which was everything to them. The risk of being caught at the border, the certainty of being hunted if we failed. All these thoughts, these practical, cowardly thoughts, lined up in my mind like figures in a ledger, and I couldn't say yes. I couldn't form the word. I told her it was too dangerous. I told her to wait, to see what happened. I offered to clean the cut. I offered her tea, as if tea was what was needed. She looked at me, and the hope just drained from her face. It was replaced by a kind of sad understanding. She didn't argue. She just nodded, turned, and left my room. I didn't follow her into the hall. That evening, maybe 3 hours later, I heard the heavy footsteps on the linoleum in the corridor. Men's footsteps. A firm, official knock on a door not far from mine. I couldn't hear the question, but I heard the answer from the dormitory monitor. Feher Katalin, room 27. My breath stopped. I stood up from my bed and pressed my back against the wall beside my own door. I pressed my whole body into the plaster as if I could become part of it. I heard her door open. I heard a murmur of voices. Then the footsteps again, coming back down the hall. Slower this time, more of them. I listened to them pass my door. I heard the soft scuff of her shoes. I did not move. I did not open the door. I did not call out. I held my breath until the footsteps faded down the stairwell. And then there was only the silence again, deeper than before. I stayed like that, against the wall, for a long time. My legs were trembling. I learned the details later, in pieces, whispered by others who were leaving, who had heard things. Under pressure, in those first hours, Katalin had given them my name. She had told them about the printing. I don't know when she did it, or what they said to make her do it. I never blamed her for it, not once. They came for me the next morning, but the dormitory administrator, Mrs. Gabor, an older woman who had always seemed stern and distant, she told them I hadn't been in the building for 3 days, that I had probably gone to my parents. It was a lie, a complete lie. She looked right at them and said it. I had not asked her to do it. I had not even spoken to her. When they left, she walked past me in the corridor. She didn't look at me. She just said, very quietly, "Pack your things. Go home today." And I did. I took the lie she had given me and I used it. I never thanked her. I never saw her again. So, that is the story of what I did not do for Katalin. I did not say yes. I did not open the door. And because of that, I stayed. I stayed, and I began the long, careful work of learning how to live in the silence I had chosen. The silence after the tanks was different. It wasn't the quiet of before. It was a held breath, a city-wide flinch. They called it consolidation. We learned it was a slow, methodical erasure. The arrests came first, in the gray winter of '57. Names you'd heard on the radio, faces from the student committees. They vanished from the lecture halls. You didn't ask. You learned to look at the empty seat without letting your eyes linger. By the time they executed Imre Nagy in '58 in secret and then announced it like a public lesson, the lesson had already been learned. I remember the announcement came over the radio in the student canteen. A clatter of a spoon against a bowl, then utter silence. I looked at my soup, the greasy film on the surface. My father's words from what felt like another life were the only thing in my head. Heads that rise get taken off. He had been right. Not right in a way that brought any comfort, just right in a terrible, factual way, like a diagnosis. I returned to my classes. I said nothing. I kept my head down. It was a physical skill, you understand. You lowered your chin, you softened your gaze, you made your body occupy less space. I resigned from the Student Literary Circle. The monthly party study session was compulsory. I attended one the first Tuesday of every month. I sat in the very last row in a chair by the door. I folded my hands in my lap and I let the slogans about socialist consciousness and the dangers of imperialist propaganda wash over me like static. I became very good at thinking about Baroque meter, while my face showed nothing. My thesis topic was the lyric poetry of the Baroque. I chose it precisely because it had no contemporary relevance. It was safe. It was about God and mortality and intricate, useless metaphors. My advisor, a kind man who had survived the war and the purges, nodded when I told him. He understood. He said, "A fine topic, Conrad Vásárhelyi, a purely academic pursuit." We both knew what that meant. I received my teaching diploma in 1960. They assigned me to a secondary school in the 8th district. It was an old building that still smelled of coal dust and damp chalk. My first classroom, I stood at the front, feeling like an imposter in my new, sensible skirt and blouse. I was teaching a lesson on The Tragedy of Man by Madach, which is all about the failures of revolutions. When a boy in the second row, maybe 15, put up his hand, he had clear, direct eyes. He asked, "What do you think about the counter-revolution of 1956, Conrad, teacher?" The official term. It hung in the air. The room went quiet. I did not hesitate, not for a second. I recited the answer from the teacher's guide about how it was a fascist provocation that had been rightly crushed by the forces of socialism. My voice was calm, flat, instructional. As I spoke, I watched his face. Was it an honest question? A test set by the headmaster? A trap laid by the boy's father, who might be in the AVH? His expression didn't change. He just nodded and said, "I see. I never knew." That was the point. You never knew. The calculation was simple. To become head of the literature department, you needed party membership. It was 1963. I applied. There was no belief in it. There was no feeling at all, except a kind of cold, practical arithmetic. I stood in a small, plain office at the district committee building, a portrait of Kadar on the wall. I raised my right hand. I swore an oath to the party and its principles, to the building of socialism, the same principles I had helped print leaflets against 7 years earlier. The words came out of my mouth. They were just sounds. The man behind the desk shook my hand. He said, "Welcome, comrade." I felt a cold, practical relief. That was all. It was done. I had secured a future, a slightly larger flat, a measure of safety for my parents. I walked out into the afternoon, and the relief felt like ash in my mouth. I had learned to be small again, but it was a different smallness. Before 56, I was small because I was young and the world was large and frightening. Now, I was small by design. I had constructed the walls of my own cage, and I walked within them very, very carefully. And for years that was enough. The silence, the carefulness, it became a life. But a life leaves traces. Questions you bury don't rot, they fossilize. And sometimes a name would surface in my mind unbidden. A name I had not spoken aloud since I pressed myself against a dormitory wall and listened to footsteps fading down a corridor. I learned what happened to her in the spring of 1961. A boy from the university, someone who had known us both, saw me at a tram stop. He told me in a low, hurried voice, looking over his shoulder. Katalin had been sentenced to 4 years in Gwajid Foghaz. She was released in 1960 under an amnesty. She had gone to West Germany. He said it all in one breath, then stepped onto the tram before I could ask anything. I stood there on the pavement, the tram pulling away. I felt a relief so sharp it was like a pain in my chest. She was alive. She was out. And then, immediately, a shame that she had endured what I had not. And underneath that, something else, something I am still ashamed to name, a kind of jealousy. She had escaped. Not just the prison, but all of it. The grayness, the watching. She was in the West, where the lights were bright and you could say what you thought. I carried that envy with me for days, a secret stone in my pocket. The letter came a year later. A blue airmail envelope, thin as a whisper, postmarked München. My address typed. I found it in the metal box in the stairwell of my block building. I opened it there, under the single bare bulb. One sheet. Her handwriting was different, neater, smaller. It said she was well. She was teaching at a gymnasium. She hoped I was also well. It was a letter that said nothing. It was the most dangerous thing I had ever held. I could feel the eyes of the building on it. I folded it, put it in my coat pocket, and walked up the 5 flights to my flat. My hands were steady. I put the kettle on. I took the letter out, read it once more by the window. Then I opened the iron door of the kitchen stove, fed the single page into the coals, and watched it curl and blacken into nothing. It took less than a minute. I made tea with the water I had boiled. I did not cry. I was too frightened for tears. I never wrote back. How could I? There was no return address. And what would I have said? I am sorry I let them take you. I am sorry I stayed. For years she existed only as that burned letter. Then, in 1975, I asked a colleague at the school, a man who sometimes visited family in Vienna, who knew people in the émigré circles. I asked him, over a grading session, as if it were idle curiosity about an old classmate. He looked at me for a long moment. He said she had married, a German engineer. She had children. She had never come back to Hungary, not even for a visit. And then he said, the one thing he had heard, she never spoke about it. About 1956, not in public, not in interviews, nothing. I thanked him. We went back to grading essays. But that silence of hers, it has lived inside me ever since. Was her silence protection for herself, for her new life? Or was it trauma? The words locked away where they could not hurt anymore. Or was it a judgment? A final verdict on all of us who stayed, who bent, who adapted. That what happened there was not worth speaking of. That we were not worth speaking to. I have no way of knowing, so I have made a Katalin for myself. In my mind, she is happy. She has a house with a garden. Her children are bilingual. She forgives me. She understands the choice I made, because she understands the weight of the fear. I have given her this understanding, this forgiveness, because I need her to have it. I have built her a whole life out of my need. I know none of it is true. It is just a story I tell so I can look at myself in the mirror. That is what I have done with my friend. I turned her into a ghost I could live with. And the real woman, the one who served 4 years and never spoke of it, she is out there somewhere in a world I cannot imagine. She carries the truth of what I did and what I did not do. And my truth is here, in this flat, in this city that has changed its face again. Sometimes I think the hole they cut from the flag was not just for the Soviet star. It was for all the things we cut out of ourselves, the people, the words, the memories that were too sharp to keep. Katalin is my hole, a shape I walk around every day. I was retired by then. I had my small flat, my books, my routines, and I was watching television. It was June 1989. They were reburying Imre Nagy, the man we had listened to on the radio, whose words had felt like a new country being born, and who they had hanged in a secret trial. Now they were carrying his coffin across Heroes Square, and the square was a sea of people. Silent, hundreds of thousands of them. I sat on the edge of my armchair, my hands in my lap, and each coffin was draped with a Hungarian flag, but not the official one. These flags had the hole cut from the center, the hole we had made in 1956. Seeing it there, on state television, on a coffin of a state martyr, it undid something in me. I started to cry. I hadn't cried in years, not like that. It was a physical ache, a release of something I had kept locked in a place deeper than memory. I didn't know if I was crying for him, for us, for the country, or for the girl I had been, who believed that hole meant freedom. People ask me now, of course, since the change. Were you in the uprising? It's the first question. The only question, sometimes. I have given different answers. For years I said nothing, a shrug, a change of subject. That was the safest. Then, when it became clear it was safe to have been a victim, I gave the half-truth. I was a student. I printed some leaflets. Then I hid. I said it with a modest smile. It was an acceptable story. A story of youthful idealism, tempered by understandable caution. It left out the mimeograph machine's heartbeat rhythm in the basement. It left out the warmth of the crowd on the embankment. And it completely erased Katalin. Her name never passed my lips. In that version, I was alone. My cowardice was private, a personal failing, not a betrayal. That was the story I told, and in telling it, I buried her a second time. I want you to understand something. I do not think I was uniquely cowardly. The system was a masterpiece of engineering. It wasn't built just to punish the brave. It was built to manufacture people like me. People who would calculate the cost of a friendship against a father's pension. Who would learn the exact pitch of silence that meant survival. It gave you the formula. One moment of courage could be traded for a lifetime of consequences. So you made the trade. I made the trade. That explanation is true. And it is also nothing. It is an explanation that explains everything and absolves nothing. For 40 years, I have held those two things in my hands. The cold, hard fact of the mechanism, and the warm, living weight of what I did. They do not balance. They never will. I kept one thing, a book. A copy of Petőfi's poems. I was reading it the week everything began. It survived because I had left it at my parents' flat. They never touched it. After they died, I found it in a drawer. The cover is soft now, the spine taped. Every October 23rd since '89, I take it out. I read the national song, the poem we shouted in the streets. Shall we be slaves or shall we be free? That was the question. I used to think it was a declaration, a line in the sand. Now I hear it only as a question, a real one. One you have to answer not once, in a street full of people, but every day, in silent rooms, in small choices. And I am no longer certain which one I chose.